Hello, this is Scott Stenson, Writing the High Places. This is a channel where I look at prophetic teachings and Holy Scripture, attempt to expand our understanding of those things. Today, I would like to look at, first of all, describe and then situate the block of passages from the book of Isaiah that are found in 2 Nephi that are so difficult for so many people, and including myself. There are many questions around this block of text that's inserted by Nephi in his second book. And so I thought I would review some Isaiah a little bit and then go over about 6 scholarly perspectives on ways to see this material, and then provide a few observations myself, and maybe talk about some unresolved questions as well, because there are many. I don't think we have a good answer as to let me just kind of up front mention that I don't think we have some sufficient answers yet, or that our answers are sufficiently watertight relative to why it is that Nephi includes this material where he does in his second book. Okay, well, anyway, to begin, the book of Isaiah, which we are told to search diligently the writings of Isaiah by Jesus in 3 Nephi, and great are the words of Isaiah. And yet they are challenging to most Latter-day Saint readers and other readers who come to the Book of Mormon. Because Isaiah, much of Isaiah is inserted into the Book of Mormon and adapted, not wholesale in every case. There's a lot of nuance to it. There's some interesting changes that have been made, and so, but we get much of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon, especially Nephi, and Jacob are fond of Isaiah, especially Nephi, and then Moroni hits it fairly hard. He also was in possession of the small plates of Nephi, therefore he was influenced by Nephi's perspective to a large degree. But Jesus, importantly, Jesus in 3 Nephi gives a great attention to the book of Isaiah, or certain chapters of the book of Isaiah, especially Isaiah 52, Isaiah 54, and so forth. He does touch on other prophets, but no one like Isaiah is quoted quite so extensively in the Book of Mormon, and for that matter, Isaiah is much quoted elsewhere in Scripture, outside of the Book of Mormon. He's the most quoted prophet. Now, and yet we have much from Zenos, who probably is a contemporary of Isaiah, and so there's a lot of interesting questions around the usage of Nephi, Isaiah by Nephi. Okay, now the part that I'm most interested today, and I've gone over in a previous video how Isaiah gets kind of woven into the pages of the Book of Mormon. There's emerging research on this by Joseph Spencer and others. But I'm interested today in the block of the largest block of material we have, which Nephi borrows Isaiah chapters 2 through 14, or the equivalent of chapters 2 through 14, and inserts them without commentary, which, mind you, this is very interesting, without commentary in his second book of Nephi, right after he's given us a great sermon, a 2-day sermon by Jacob on the covenant. And he follows that large block, that 10-chapter block of material, with a great prophecy of his own, that in large part seems influenced by some of his earlier revelations that he had recorded in 1 Nephi. But anyway, what to do with this block of material is the question of this video. Okay, so let's get at, first of all, in the book of Isaiah, there are arguably 3 different Isaiahs that the scholars talk about. Now, in the Book of Mormon, this becomes a problem because really all of these chapters are presented as though they're from one Isaiah, the same Isaiah who received his call in Isaiah chapter 6 of the book of Isaiah. However, scholars talk about 1st Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, and 3rd Isaiah. Now, 1st Isaiah is sometimes seen as the historical Isaiah, or is the historical Isaiah, according to the scholars. 2nd Isaiah is some later figure who writes about the Babylonian exile, or writes material that has, so it's not contemporary with the 8th century Isaiah from Jerusalem, but it's material that is categorized or placed with the historical period of, say, the 6th century, the time of the Babylonian captivity and so forth. And then the 3rd Isaiah are the last 10 chapters of the book of Isaiah. And so we get the first half of the book of Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39 is considered 1st Isaiah. And then 40 through, say, 55 is considered Deutero-Isaiah or 2nd Isaiah. And then we have 3rd Isaiah, which are the final 10 chapters of that book. Now, the thing is that's so interesting here is the Book of Mormon does not use the first chapter of the book of Isaiah. It doesn't invoke the first chapter of the book of Isaiah, nor does it tap into these last 10 chapters at all. Whereas the New Testament does. The New Testament does pull upon significantly upon some passages from that third voice, that 3rd Isaiah that scholars talk about. But the majority of what the Book of Mormon prophets do is they spend time with chapters 48 through about 54. And by the way, in that sequence too, 48 first, 49 second, 50, 51, and so forth, all the way through 54, and a little bit of 55 as well. But there's this strange passage found in 2nd Nephi. I call it strange because it's hard to account for. There's this interesting 10 chapter block that's borrowed from 1st Isaiah and inserted in 2nd Nephi, again, without commentary. Okay, so that's the situation. So the problem of Isaiah is that the Book of Mormon presents one Isaiah. The scholars think of two or three Isaiahs. So how to account for that in terms of the scholarship is one question. But also, what is Nephi doing with these 10 chapters that he borrows almost intact and brings them from the brass plates record into his second book? Okay, now these chapters come, as I said, from Isaiah 2 through 14. Now, what is this material about in the book of Isaiah? Well, much of this material comes from the first 12 chapters of the book of Isaiah, which has to do with Isaiah's life, the calling of Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6. It has to do with some of the early themes that Isaiah sets up relative to Judah and Israel and so forth. But then we get about chapter 13 of Isaiah, and chapters 13 and 14 are part of this block in the second book of Isaiah. We get from chapters 13 to about chapter 23, maybe as far as 27, what are called oracles against the nations. Okay, so we see Babylon, we see the destruction of Babylon in chapters 13 and 14, and some mention of Assyria, but really much of what Nephi inserts has to do with judgments coming upon Israel and Judah, Israel being the northern kingdom and Judah being the southern kingdom. And so what to do with this? Why would Nephi speak of the covenant through Jacob's sermon, or have all this material about redemption and so forth, and then insert this passage, these extended passages about judgments and destructions upon Israel and Judah, and finally Babylon? Okay, so he taps into a piece of the oracle against the nations that are found more extensively in the book of Isaiah, but he does largely take these chapters from chapter 2 of Isaiah, which is a really powerful chapter. Chapter 2 of Isaiah is just wonderful and may contain a thesis, kind of a central idea that gets kind of iterated and or expanded in the rest of the block. But this is the nature of kind of what is being borrowed by Nephi from Isaiah, apparently. Okay, and so that's the situation. Now, that's good context. I think that will be helpful. Now, what are the scholars saying about these? What have the scholars said about these things? Well, let's take the first scholar on my list to look at. In a volume from the Collected Works of Hugh Nibley, Old Testament and Related Studies, we have a chapter called Great Are the Words of Isaiah, in which Dr. Nibley, famously, Brother Nibley, writes in his interesting style about many of the chapters found in this block of material. And he writes about them much as he does in the vein of his other great collected work called approaching Zion. And so he talks about how Isaiah is speaking at great length about those who are in power oppressing those who are not in power. Okay, so for instance, let me just give you a flavor of this. He says oppression is one of the major themes within this block of material, or within the book of Isaiah generally, actually. And rather than read all of it to you or even pick through it, I'll just say this feels very much like I'm reading Approaching Zion. So Dr. Nibley wrote this in 1978. He's one of the earliest things I could find on this particular block of material. And he does cover Isaiah 1 here, but he covers a lot of the chapters found from 2 to 14, and then he does wade into later chapters of the book of Isaiah as well. But here's a quick excerpt that I'll just share with you. He writes, "By far, the commonest charge Isaiah brings against the wicked is oppression," and then he gives us an ancient word for oppression. "The word means to choke, to grab by the neck and squeeze, grasp, or press, to take the fullest advantage of someone in your power. In short, to maximize profits." Okay, so the oppressor and the oppressed, and by the way, much here is about Babylon and the competitive and predatory society that is indicative of Babylon, the great marketplace. Okay, so if you know anything about Nibley's Approaching Zion, you'll know the tenor of this particular essay that was written involving many of the chapters from this block of material that we're discussing. And so Nibley sees it in those terms, and by the way, his evidence is pretty extensive. Isaiah and many of the prophets were very concerned about the oppression of the poor and of the disenfranchised by those who were in power positions, either religiously or politically or economically and otherwise. And that is very much what he sees happening in the book of Isaiah. Now, that may not jive with your particular politics, but the prophets were very concerned about these types of disparities and oppressive kinds of relationships. And the Oracle Against the Nations, this material, like I said, largely focuses on the iniquities that are found within Israel and in Judah. Okay, so these are types of sins and iniquities that can be found among the Lord's people, and not the nations necessarily that he has issues with. That's not really until we get to the the chapters of the Babylonian destruction. He's really speaking to his own people, the covenant people, those who should know better, but many of them all of them are out of the way, essentially. And okay, so that's Nibley's reading of that block of material, with this theme emerging. Now, this is not too different from David Seeley's understanding of this block of material. And he narrows this down just a little bit further and talks about the sin of pride. Okay, so these chapters, he suggests, correspond well to Nephi's other discussions elsewhere about the sin of pride in terms of the great and abominable church. Okay, so Seeley is not too far removed. He's not nearly as specific and doesn't tie it nearly as closely to Babylonian economics and the predatory nature of Babylonian economic markets and so forth, and how Babylon was obsessed with the things of the marketplace and of the world. But he does speak more generally of pride. Seeley does, and Seeley suggests that these chapters are largely inserted to underscore the theme of pride, and not necessarily not just oppression. Well, again, I think Seeley's comments are much more narrow than Nibley's comments, because part of oppression is this idea of pride. It's because there's pride that there is oppression. But Seeley wants to have us talk about, or believes these chapters are inserted primarily to help us focus on this particular sin. Although he does show, or he does attempt to show, that there are other themes here that are accompanied by the theme of pride, and he looks to Messianic material, which I think is a weaker argument, I know what Nephi says about inserting the Isaiah chapters in his writings to more fully persuade his people of the Messiah. But I have some ideas to suggest there. Now, I think I don't think that Isaiah is brought in the way we think he is relative to the Messiah. In other words, we tend to think about Nephi brings in the Messiah in order to discuss the life and ministry of the Messiah, or the atoning sacrifice of the Messiah, or something relative to his nativity. And there is some evidence for that in these chapters, but I don't think that's the main reason that Nephi brings these chapters in, or for that matter, the later chapters. I think it has, and so instead of thinking of Nephi bringing in these chapters in order to illustrate or somehow suggest the Messiah, the life and times of the Messiah from the New Testament, I think we need to think of this incorporation of this Isaianic material in terms of introducing us to more of a divine warrior. Okay, in other words, yes, there's some suggestion of his nativity, there's some suggestion of his life and his infinite atonement, and the fact that he would give himself as a ransom for many and so forth. But primarily these chapters, I'm not talking about Isaiah 53 per se, I'm talking about these chapters 2 through 14. I think it's much clearer, and by the way, these later chapters found in Isaiah 48 to 55, there's much there about the coming of the Lord, but in terms of, in kind of an apocalyptic sense, meaning he comes as a deliverer to his covenant people, as a divine warrior. And in that sense, I seek to more fully persuade my people of him, that they might believe on him. Because he comes to deliver them and to be faithful to his promises, and to provide them salvation and deliverance as it's needed in a day of trouble. I think that's closer to this idea of, searching the words of Isaiah for messianic references relative to the life and times of the Messiah and the atoning sacrifice of the Messiah. Though those types of individual passages can be identified, these seem to be alluded to. I don't think it's nearly as strong a case as this other kind of Messiah. In other words, not the lamb, but the lion. I think that Isaiah wants us to think about the lion nature of the Messiah, as opposed to merely the lam coming as the babe in Bethlehem and so forth. I think Isaiah's got a much kind of more apocalyptic vision of. Now, and this is what Seeley says. This isn't what Dr. Seeley says, or Brother Seeley or Dr. Seeley. He's on the faculty at BYU. Anyway, pride, though, a messianic quality that he would say ties to the life and times of Jesus. And then he also, along with that messianic angle, if I remember right here, he, let me see if I can remind myself the other thing he takes up here, besides pride and the messianic nature of the. He does spend some time with the nations that are being addressed in the prophecies that are found in this block of material. He says that the prophecies come to Judah, Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is considered Zion. It's synonymous with Zion, Israel, and, like I said, Babylon. So there seems to be that. Now, there's much more here in his particular presentation, but I think much of his presentation dwells on this idea. The theme of pride seems central to these chapters. Again, that's not unrelated to Nibley's claim, but Nibley, I think, is much more precise and much more convincing and persuasive about the nature of how pride is manifest in that among the Lord's people in that day and time. And so it gives kind of a point to what Seeley's claiming, kind of in general terms. It gives more of a fine point to it. It gives us kind of more of a sense of what that type of aggressive, materialistic Babylonian society, that is, these Babylonian values transported and kind of operating among the people of the Lord, what they look like. I think that's a fair way to put it. Anyway, both have tapped into this idea, though, although Nibley's more particular and Seeley's more general. Okay? All right, now one last one. This is probably one of my favorites of the three, and that's John Gee's work looking at these chapters, and he's also found, I didn't pull this out, but this is late 1990s, Isaiah in the Book of Mormon, and we get a bunch of different essays. John Gee has one of the essays here. And and Seeley's was in this particular collection, as are others that I may or may not refer to. John Gee, though, he gets into, he says that these chapters are basically designed around the Zion-Babylon binary. Okay, so Zion, again, Jerusalem, Israel, and Jerusalem are much discussed in the first several chapters of this block of material. So Gee talks about this block of chapters can be understood as in terms of Nephi's two churches concept. In other words, Zion and Babylon, or the church of the Lamb and the church of the devil. And so he sees this block of material as kind of having resonance with Nephi's earlier great revelation, where we do in chapter 14 of 1 Nephi see the Zion, kind of the Lamb, the church of the Lamb versus the church of the devil, or the great and abominable church. And he sees some of these patterns, this same kind of dualistic pattern brought into this block of material, or inserted through this block of material into the second book of Nephi, which I think is closer to the truth, a little closer to the truth. So yes, this is about oppression. Yes, this is about pride in general. These chapters are inserted because Nephi is interested in these particular things. By the way, when he quotes Jacob's sermon just before he includes this block of material, he does speak of the rich and the learned, and those who were puffed up in their pride. In fact, he has this really interesting passage which confirms, it might suggest why this material of Jacob's comes right before the block of material. So in 2 Nephi chapter 9, I'll just remind you some of the language that we get from Jacob. He says, he writes about the learned. He says, "Oh, that cunning plan of the evil one, oh, the vainness and the frailties and the foolishness of men. When they are learned, they think they are wise. And they hearken not unto the counsel of God, for they set it aside, supposing they know of themselves. Wherefore, their wisdom is foolishness, and it profiteth them not, and they shall perish." There's that apocalyptic element that I think is built into this. "But to be learned is good." So there's the positive principle. To be learned is good if they hearken unto the counsels of God. But here's the other group that Jacob identifies here right before the block of Isaiah chapters are introduced to us. "But woe unto the rich." Remember Nibley's comments about the rich oppressing the poor and so forth, and or the powerful, the aristocracy and the priestly class oppressing, the others. "But woe unto the rich, who are rich as to the things of the world, for because they are rich, they despise the poor and persecute the meek. And their hearts are upon their treasures, wherefore their treasure is their God." Okay, and this is what Nibley's talking about in his treatise. "And behold, their treasure shall perish with them also." And by the way, that word perish, because of the earlier part of Jacob's teachings, we have to understand this word perish in terms of perishing according to both temporally and spiritually. In other words, apocalyptic destruction, as well as spiritual captivity and the torments of hell, essentially, are being discussed here. The word perish then refers to the death of the body, but also the death of the spirit. So, it's interesting to point out, too, that there are 10 woes here in this sermon from Jacob right before the block of Isaiah material is introduced. There are 10 woes given us by Nephi through Jacob. And interestingly enough, the oracles against the nation that Nephi gives us a glimpse at in chapters 13 and 14 of 2 Nephi, the beginning of the oracles of nations, apparently there are 10 of those oracles against the nations. So, by the way, oracle means it's a burden pronounced by the prophet against the nation, some burden, some kind of condemnation, some kind of oracle of judgment pronounced against the nations. But we only get a view of this briefly at the end of the block that's given to us by Nephi. But I'm suggesting, or I think it's worth suggesting, that Jacob, this sermon inserted by Jacob by Nephi, right before the block of material by Nephi, has some commonalities, including, if Nibley's right, or if Seeley's right, and Nibley's right, then some of these themes about pride of the learned and of the rich are simply anticipating why Nephi may insert this block of material about the oppression of the disenfranchised and the pride that's operating among the covenant people, and how these things harken back to Nephi's earlier teachings anyway, from First Nephi, fairly directly. Remember, even as far back as Lehi's dream, if you want to go back that far, but certainly to Nephi's vision, where he sees the oppression happening, where the church of the devil, which is in all the nations of the earth, is persecuting the humble followers of God, who are also in all the nations, but only few in number, and so forth. Okay, so I think Jacob's teachings are not unrelated to the block of material. Now, these gentlemen, these scholars I've been citing, don't make that case directly. That's just my personal insertion here, but it seems to be a justification of their scholarly efforts, that these themes seem to be tracking across the block of material. So from earlier in Nephi's teachings, in Jacob's sermon that's inserted in chapters 6 to 10, and then apparently resonate also or have a relationship to the Isaiah block of material in 2 through 14 of 2nd Nephi. All right, but there are three other scholars I wanted to get to today, and then make a parting comment or two about my own views, additional to those views I've already expressed. So more current scholarship. This was done. What I've been discussing so far was some of the old guard, from the late 90s or whatever. So, Nibley was from 1978, as I mentioned. So there's some of this earlier scholarship, seems to kind of work in this direction. And I like Guy's work with the Zion Babylon pattern. By the way, I've documented, and I won't necessarily belabor this, but I've documented that the structure of the Nephite writings is very much based on this idea of the Jew and the Gentile. The pattern of the Jew first discussed, the Jewish nation discussed, and then the Gentiles are brought in secondarily. And this can be seen all the way through First Nephi into Second Nephi, and all the way up to this block of material. So the fact that John Guy talks about Zion and Babylon, think about Zion as being the Jewish question, okay, the covenant people of the Lord, Zion, and then what do we get to? Well, in the block of material we have Israel, Judah discussed for several chapters, and at the very end of the block of material we get the destruction of Babylon. So we get a very similar kind of pattern repeated in the block of material, much like earlier throughout the writings of Nephi. Nephi gives us Lehi gives it to us in 1 Nephi chapter 10. First of all, prophecy from Lehi. He speaks of the Jewish question, and then of the Gentile question in terms of the house of Israel and their recovery. And then this goes on all the way through the writings of Nephi. And this block of material may be seen, I think, as looking first at the Jewish question, the iniquity among the Jews, Israel and Judah, and then the destruction of the Gentiles, or what I would call, what has been called the Babylonians, but maybe we can see that the pattern being repeated there in terms of the Gentiles, because the Babylonians are Gentiles. In fact, anyone who's not of Israel is a Gentile, okay, is considered a Gentile by the Jews. So when Cyrus comes out of, when Cyrus approves the deliverance of the Jews back to their homeland, they're being delivered by the Gentiles, okay. The Gentile nations are providing a way for the restoration of Israel back in 530 BC. Okay, so it's the Jew and Gentile question, and that same pattern holds up through the block of material, because we have Israel, Judah discussed first in terms of their iniquities and the judgments upon them, and then the judgments upon Babylon, and so the pattern is already present throughout the writings of Nephi. This is just more of that pattern, and that, I think, is what John Guy is tapping into with his Zion Babylon kind of look at that pattern. He doesn't tie it to the rest of the writings of Nephi as I just did, but that seems to be also very plausible as a way to understand why this is inserted where it is inserted after Jacob's teachings and after Nephi's earlier teachings, where this pattern is established. Okay, these later scholars, though, are Hardy, Spencer, Joseph Spencer, and Grant Hardy, and then Terryl Gibbons. I'll make a quick note on Terryl Gibbons, just because he's widely read by Latter-day Saints. Okay, so Hardy, his is nice and brief. Okay, there's a brief. I wonder if I have his book nearby here. Maybe I didn't bring it. Give me just a second to see if I can locate. Yeah, I might have placed it back on the shelf. That's not important. I can go ahead and just summarize it. So Hardy, in his latest book, having to do with it's the annotated version of the Book of Mormon, which is a book I've featured on my Facebook page or whatever. He does some work, and in the beginning of Second Nephi, the material that kind of introduces the book of Second Nephi, he talks about this block of Isaiah chapters as anticipating or foreshadowing the destruction that would come upon the Nephites in Third Nephi and at the end of their civilization, 4 centuries after the coming of Christ. And so he sees these chapters as discussing judgments and destructions upon the Lord's people, and that these things, in a sense, prophetically foreshadow, if I'm not mischaracterizing him, that these writings, in some sense, prophetically foreshadow the destruction of the Nephites, or of the seed of Lehi, I should say, in chapter 8 of 3rd Nephi, and then later in the Book of Mormon, about chapter 6 or so of the Book of Mormon, when the Nephite civilization is annihilated, that these things anticipate those things. Because what I haven't said or haven't made a big deal of is that these chapters that Nephi is inserting here are not about restoration primarily. They're about the judgments of God upon his covenant people. Now, which is interesting because Nephi has been talking about restoration, right? He's been talking about restoration so much in the covenant, like Jacob's sermon is all about the covenant and the restoration of his people and so forth from their scattered and fallen condition. And so for Nephi to place this block of material and to have it be so thoroughly about judgment and condemnation of the covenant people, then it's disorienting a little bit. But Grant Hardy suggests that these things are just to prophetically suggest that Nephi has seen the demise of his people in vision. He has seen their destruction. And he's inserting these things as a warning voice for those later apocalyptic type of endings to the nation, both at the time of the coming of the Lord to Bountiful and the time of the annihilation of his people 4 centuries after the coming of the Lord to the Lehites, to the seed of Lehi. Now, I think that there's some accuracy to that, except he doesn't make the case for that. He just suggests that and moves on. It's a claim he makes without any evidence per se, but I can see where he's drawing this idea from, because Nephi sees the destruction of his people, and then Nephi inserts this material after discussing their restoration. He shows that they will be destroyed, or he does discuss the demise of the house of Israel, or I should say Israel and Judah, and so on and so forth. And all of this material implicitly then suggests this prophetic future for them. It's not an argument he makes. It's just a claim that's kind of inserted in his introductory material to his annotated Book of Mormon that I've been reviewing. Now, I would simply tweak that. Okay, in other words, I think Nephi is writing a latter-day audience and inserting these chapters as a warning voice, but not for the seed of Lehi in 3rd Nephi, or to prefigure the annihilation of the Nephite people at the end of the Book of Mormon. But I believe that he's inserting these passages for his latter-day reader. Now, these are things he taught his brethren, of course, contemporaries. But these things are inserted in the small plates, it would seem to me, to provide a warning voice for the people of the Lord in the last days before the coming of the Lord to the earth in his second advent. Okay, so it's another apocalyptic setting, And by the way, I believe books 1st and 2nd Nephi are apocalyptic. If they're anything, they're apocalyptic books. They're books that have an apocalyptic theme to them. And so restoration is part of it, but judgments coming upon the people of the Lord who, judgments coming upon not just the people of the Lord, but upon all the nations of the earth is also prefigured in this material. Okay, so I like Grant Hardy's reading. I would just place it in the latter day for its application, as opposed to merely 3rd Nephi. Although 3rd Nephi is a pattern for the second coming, or Helaman through, say, 3rd Nephi chapter 8 or 9 or whatever it is, when the judgments fall and Christ visits the 3rd Nephi, even when Jesus is among them. All of that seems to prefigure the day of tribulation before the second coming, and the coming of the Lord to the world, and his ushering in of his millennial kingdom. That seems to be suggested by 3rd Nephi and the book of Helaman. And so I just place it in a different day than Hardy does. Hardy likes to stay within the Book of Mormon history itself and say it's going to happen. These things prefigure 3rd Nephi's events and those events recounted by Mormon. I say these things will happen in the latter day, and these chapters are apocalyptic in nature. They're a warning voice to the latter day audience. Now, by the way, I'm not just making this up, because I do have a reason for believing that. And so let me share with you, at the end of sharing this block of material that Nephi shares with his reader, he does say this, which I find so characteristic of it's Amos 3:7 all over again. It's just in Nephi's language. But this seems very important to me. So after recounting this block, or basically quoting this major block of material, Nephi gets us into why or how it is that one is to experience, or one is to think about this block of material. In chapter 25 of 2nd Nephi, we get his comments. It's not a commentary on the block of material, not a specific commentary in any way, but it is a light commentary, or suggestive in a really, really light way of what we can think of. So, verse 3 of 2nd Nephi chapter 25, which is right on the heels of this block of material, he says, "Wherefore I, Nephi, write unto my people," latter-day people, okay, my people meaning the seed of my own seed and the seed of my brethren, "unto all those that shall receive hereafter these things," that's even broader than what I just said, "which I write, that they may know the judgments of God, that they come upon all nations according to the word which he hath spoken." And I think there he's referring to the 10 chapters that he's just quoted from. So why has he inserted these things? Well, in part, not to kind of make clear the restoration idea, although we do have Isaiah chapter 11 in this material, and it's about the restoration. There's some restoration imagery throughout this block of material. Primarily, this material, though, is about the judgments that are coming upon Israel and Judah and Babylon, as I said. So when he says, "I have inserted these things, I write these things that my people and everyone else who receives this record may know of the judgments of God, that they come upon all nations, according to the words which I have already spoken." And I think he's referring there not only to his first book of Nephi, but more recently to the things he taught his brethren, which are recorded just barely right before this chapter ensues. Now, by the way, he repeats this idea later in this same block, in this same early part of the Book of Mormon, when he says in verse 6, "And I have made mention unto my children concerning the judgments of God. So I have taught my people in my day concerning the judgments of God, which hath come to pass among the Jews. I've made mention of these things to my children," in other words, in my day, "according to all that which Isaiah hath spoken, and I do not write them in this record." In other words, I do not expand upon them. I do not extensively expound upon these things in my record. There's no commentary that I find. No, well, Jack Welch, this is one of the things that Jack says, or Dr. Welch says. He says that this block of material is commented upon by the great prophecy of Nephi. I don't see that that's a strong argument. There are, yes, Isaiah 11 is brought up in this block of material, and Isaiah 11 becomes an important part of the great prophecy of Nephi. So on that score, on that point, yes. But largely, there's no reason for Nephi to include these 10 chapters or this block of material. If he's only going to borrow Isaiah 11 and a part of Isaiah 11, then why not just quote Isaiah 11 and then bring it forward into the great prophecy and then comment upon it? But he doesn't do that. And he certainly doesn't, Nephi does not comment upon this block of material in some exhaustive way or some kind of thorough way. He simply just takes up Isaiah 11 and uses it again. And then there's them really, really light, smaller things. But this is not great. Nephi's prophecy is not meant to be a commentary on this block of material. That's why it's so puzzling. Because you would think he would comment upon it, because he's commented upon Isaiah 48 and 49 at the end of 1st Nephi. He's commented upon, or Jacob's commented upon Isaiah 50 and 51 in his teachings. And clearly it was a commentary on those Isaiah passages. But Nephi quotes 10 chapters, and then he doesn't follow with commentary. All he says is, I share these things that you might know of the judgments of God, that they come upon all the nations of the earth. And these things are to be understood by my latter-day reader. Now, I'll just add this. This is characteristic of Amos 3:7, I think. And this is why I read it in the way that I think Hardy's not too far from the truth here when he says what he says. So verse 9, in the same passage from 2 Nephi chapter 25, it says, and as one generation hath been destroyed, okay, Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians, Judah was eventually destroyed by the Babylonians, and as one generation has been destroyed after another among the Jews because of iniquity, and the iniquities were laid out in this block of material, right? These iniquities were laid out. And by the way, Nibley says the iniquities are not just oppression, but also sexual perversion and other types of iniquities. But he certainly highlights, sexual perversions or sexual sins, as well as oppression of the disenfranchised by those who are in positions of religious power, political power, or otherwise, educational, anybody who has power in society, the aristocracy and so forth. As one generation has been destroyed among the Jews because of iniquity, even so, here's the comparison, even so have they been destroyed from generation to generation according to their iniquities, and never hath any of them been destroyed, save it were foretold them by the prophets of the Lord. And so to what extent are these chapters that Nephi inserts in 2 Nephi a prophetic warning of the type that Hardy speaks about and that I have recently spoken about? Now, Hardy would say it's a prophetic warning relative to the Nephite nation itself, which, well, he did teach these things to his contemporaries, so that makes sense. But I would go as far as to say that he's also recorded these things on the small plates, that the latter-day audience might have a warning voice as to what's coming upon the earth, because the Lord doesn't send forth judgment upon the nations of the earth unless they have been warned by the prophets. This is Amos 3:7. This is an eternal principle. The Lord God will do nothing unto the children of men until he revealeth his secret or his message, or some kind of these preparatory types of messages to the people that will be affected by those things that are coming upon them. So the prophets are always sent first to prepare the way that all might be accountable for their own sins, and that God, his hands might be, that he might be perfectly just and perfectly fair and perfectly just in his dealings with us. He sends the prophets to gather in all who will gather in, but then he does say that these things are coming, so you need to gather in and listen to my servants, and if you don't, then I can't, then you're going to choose destruction for yourself, even though it's not what I want for you, because I would have you gather and be safe and protected, but you would not. You would not. And so I think that this follow-up passage, as before we get into Nephi's great prophecy, helps us see why Nephi might be adding this material in, but it doesn't answer all the questions, though. And because this video is getting rather long, let me just say that Joseph Spencer does the most exhaustive work that I've seen recently, and certainly the most recent work on this block of material. And he has a very complicated notion of this block of material. He's put a lot of effort and time into his work on the book of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. I have his book here, A Word in Season, which is Isaiah's influence and usage, why it is that how Isaiah is being used in the Book of Mormon, the larger record of the Book of Mormon. But in making his comments relative to this block of material, he does have some extensive things to say about how it's organized. He sees it as designed as a three-scene story. We have a problem being established in the prophecy, or in these prophecies. A problem is the iniquity of the people among the covenant people. There's iniquity among the covenant people. Then he talks about Isaiah chapters 11 and 12 as being kind of the solution to the problem, is the restoration of the gospel, and the millennial kingdom is ushered in Isaiah chapters 11 and 12. And then he doesn't really know how to account for the Babylonian material very well, but he calls it a celebration, an odd, strange, kind of morbid celebration of I forget how he puts it, the celebration of the conquering of the work of God succeeding in this kind of way when the judgments come upon Babylon and so forth, and the kingdom of God is on the earth and established, and Babylon falls, and there's a kind of a morbid celebration here that I think he alludes to, if I'm not mistaken. So to keep things brief, Spencer puts a lot of work into Isaiah's presence in the Book of Mormon. He does talk about this block of material, and he acknowledges it's hard to account for this material, but he does start to say that I think that, this is his argument, I think that Isaiah chapter 8 prefigures, so Isaiah made a record and it was to be sealed up for a later time, for the benefit of a later time in history. And he sees that as a pattern. So chapter 8 of Isaiah, which is in this block of material, seems to kind of have a resonance with Isaiah chapter 29, where we see again a book being interred, a book being kind of a book being produced and or kept and preserved that it might benefit a later generation in history. And so Isaiah, I think Spencer reads the passage as saying, okay, there's a problem, Israel's going to be scattered, there's iniquity, they're going to be destroyed by their enemies. But Isaiah, who in his day was famously not understood by his people because he was told literally, to preach to them, but they won't understand you and they won't receive you. So he inters his writings. In chapter 8, we see then that the testimony is sealed up. Okay, the Isaiah testimony is sealed up to come forth in a day when the people would be more receptive and they could be restored in some fashion. That same pattern Spencer sees this discussed in this block of material. He sees it happening or being discussed by Nephi when Nephi begins in his great final prophecy to use Isaiah 29 to more fully discuss the coming forth of the Book of Mormon among the Gentiles to all the nations. It's a book that had been, prepared in day of iniquity when there was great destruction upon the earth. And the book comes forth at a later time to a people that would be more receptive, or at least some would be more receptive, and it would end up blessing many nations and many people. So Spencer wants to read these Isaiah chapters as somehow setting up a pattern of problem, of judgments, restoration, and celebration that gets kind of fulfillment and further coverage in Nephi's mind in and through the record he's preparing, and that it has a relationship to that. And so the pattern set up in Isaiah, it's inserted in 2nd Nephi as a part of kind of being more fully brought to pass in the latter day through this Nephite record. Now, Spencer would argue that this material is the most sacred material that Nephi prepares for us. So chapter 6, where Jacob begins his teaching, chapters 6 to about 25 or 24, 25, is what Spencer would say is the most sacred material. And he uses a verse in 1 Nephi 19 to kind of make that case. I don't exactly subscribe to that view, because there are many equally sacred things in 1 Nephi. Clearly, 1 Nephi, as he says in his own writings, as Spencer says in his own writings, is an introduction to these other things that come later. But anyway, Spencer has a very interesting argument. He ties this three-part structure. He builds this three-part structure. He sees this three-part structure in this Isaiah block of material, and then he says this can be understood. This helps us understand better the nature of. The implication is, in my mind anyway, that Nephi's great final prophecy can be understood better in light of this pattern that's given to us by this block of material as he understands it. I won't go into the other particulars of his argument, but again, he's got a whole book here discussing Isaiah's presence in the Book of Mormon. Some of the ideas I fully subscribe to. Some of the ideas I push back on a little bit, but he's the authority right now in terms of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. He seems to be the best acquainted with Isaiah's scholarship and also Book of Mormon scholarship to make this particular case. But however, my view, and this is my closing here, I've already expressed many of my personal ideas, but it's my view that Guy's, Gentile / Zion Babylon pattern that Nephi works with throughout his writings is suggested by this block of material, and is also later suggested in the Great Prophecy by Nephi. So we're situating the block material does have a familiarity. It should belong where it is. It makes sense in terms of this pattern between the Jew-Gentile pattern that's getting repeated. If we simply understand the block is looking at the sins of Israel and Judah, and Babylon is a Gentile entity, or Babylon that's being destroyed in chapters 13 and 14 as being a Gentile entity, then the pattern hasn't been broken. It's just been repeated with interesting variation to it. Again, I'll say this, that whereas in 1 Nephi we get Isaiah quoted extensively, we get a brief blip on Isaiah, and then we get Isaiah's chapter 48 and 49 quoted. The idea is, according to Spencer anyway, is that judgment is first discussed in Isaiah 48 or chapter 20 of 1 Nephi, and then restoration is discussed in 1 Nephi 21 or Isaiah 49, and that that may be an oversimplification, but that is how Spencer views it. Now, I accept that. I mean, more or less. It's not quite. It's a little bit oversimplified, and I have an argument, that's much more particular than that I want to make at some future stage. But 2 Nephi apparently is just the reverse of that. Instead of saying judgment leads to restoration, which is what seems to be why Isaiah is being used at the end of 1 Nephi. In 2 Nephi, we see a lot of judgment and a very little. There's imagery relative to restoration, and there's even Isaiah 11 and 12 that are there. So there's some about restoration, but largely this block of material from 2 to 14 of Isaiah, or from 2 Nephi chapter 12 to 24. This material is largely about judgment upon the covenant people, and it's largely about the iniquities of the house of Israel, or Israel and Judah, and it also prefigures the destruction of Babylon. And so I would suggest that if it was about restoration primarily, the use of Isaiah was about restoration in 1 Nephi. In 2 Nephi, it's now primarily about the judgments coming upon Israel and Judah and Babylon, and less about restoration, although restoration is present in Isaiah 11, in several parts, in Isaiah chapter 2 and in other parts, and Isaiah 11 most importantly, because Moroni brings this chapter and says, this is about to be fulfilled in the latter days. He says as much to Joseph Smith. And then Isaiah 11, which is about the millennial reign and the establishment of the kingdom of God and the peace on earth and so forth. But it's primarily, though, about judgment and destruction. And Nephi acknowledges as much in chapter 25 of 2 Nephi. He says, I've given you these things that you might know, that judgment comes upon all the nations of the earth. And I wanted you to have that warning voice. In fact, every time judgment's coming upon the earth and destruction, the Lord always has sent his prophets to forewarn the people. And so 2 Nephi, this block of material, although it has restoration elements, And that is the hopeful element that Nephi wants us to think about primarily. It's largely in tonality about judgments and destructions, but there is a glimmer of hope that Nephi is trying to point us towards. There is a glimmer of hope because the day of restoration, which he really fully explains in his great prophecy later on, using Isaiah 29, when this book comes forward to usher in a great and marvelous work among the people, and when the Lord sets his hand again a second time to recover his people. That's from Isaiah 11. And this is, so the hopeful tone does come through, but I'm suggesting that judgment and destruction are the primary tonality of this passage of Scripture. But the implication is, if these things are destroyed, then there's a day of restoration. So the implication is such that it's hopeful. And we learn about the nature of the coming forth of the restoration, the Book of Mormon, and the restoration among all the nations before the end, before the Lord comes in glory, and knowledge is established like a flood. Well, knowledge covers the earth as the waters cover the sea before the end of the second book of Nephi. Okay, now I have other comments here, but I think I've more or less touched on all of them. So what's interesting to me, the final comment, is Nephi initially starts using Isaiah to discuss his people in context with the house of Israel, because these prophecies were for the house of Israel. And if they're for the house of Israel, then they also relate to the Gentile question. But by the time he shares this block of scripture that he does in 2 Nephi chapter 12, by the time he gets there, he says, you might read, whoever sees these things might have hope for all mankind. So there's a universality to it that isn't present necessarily as I read it in 1 Nephi. In the earlier suggestions, it's about his people and likening his people to the writings of Isaiah, which were largely about the house of Israel and the Jews and their restoration, and his people and their restoration. But now we get the aperture opened up, and this block of material apparently has to do with hope that can now be extended to all men. It says twice, all men on the earth, meaning this is about much more than just the restoration of a righteous branch. This is much more than just the restoration of the Jews. This is more than even the Gentile question. This is for all men, meaning all of humankind. Okay, so the aperture seems to open up further and further, and by the end of 2 Nephi, all the ends of the earth are being addressed. All the inhabitants of the earth are being addressed. And there's just been a real kind of opening up of this material. In fact, famously, 2 Nephi chapter 26 is about how inclusive the Lord is in inviting all to partake of his salvation, to partake of his goodness. And these materials in 2 Nephi appear to just kind of suggest that there are judgments that are coming upon the earth, but there is a restoration, and all men will have the opportunity to hearken to the voice of warning and partake of salvation in the final day, when the voice comes to them, when the voice of the Lamb comes to them in and through the Nephite record and the restoration of the gospel. Okay, there are unresolved questions. This is not, I don't mean to be dogmatic. There are many loose ends here. It is not yet a settled question. Why this block of material in the middle part of 2 Nephi? How can we situate it? Why is there no commentary provided? No, I mean, there are some moments of commentary, but they're so brief and they're so insufficient, I think, compared to the other examples of commentary we get in 1 Nephi and 2 Nephi, where Jacob comments on Isaiah 50 and 51 more extensively. Why do we not have more commentary on these chapters by Nephi, or thereafter more commentary, more interaction with this material? It's unclear to me. And how does this all relate to 1 Nephi and the apocalyptic imagery and so forth at the end of 1 Nephi, and the apocalyptic elements of chapter 6 of 2 Nephi, and some of the contents of Jacob's teachings in chapter 6 through 10? What is exactly the nature of the relationship? I've said that the passage is definitely just more of this apocalyptic theme that gets in 1 Nephi, 2 Nephi early on. It's just more of that kind of thing. It has that apocalyptic feel to it, and it very much is of a piece with the rest of the material, even though it's not entirely clear at every point how it's seamlessly kind of woven in together. So how does this relate to First Nephi? How does this material in Second Nephi relate to First Nephi's material? And why not? And here's another question that nobody really, scholars don't seem to want to take up. This is a literary question. Why would Nephi give us the principles for reading Isaiah in chapter 25 when the Isaiah material we're reading actually begins in chapter 12 of Second Nephi? Why not place that material before we get to the block of material by Isaiah? These are questions I would ask Nephi if I could, and maybe it's just it falls in that category. This is how the Jews prophesied, and this is how the Jews instructed, that they provided delayed principles of the hermeneutical principles whereby one performs exegesis are provided after the fact. So the passage is given, and then the principles for reading the passage are given in a delayed fashion. Maybe that's kind of standard for the Jewish kind of the Near Eastern mindset or something of that nature. But in the Western mind, you would provide the strategies for reading a passage earlier than providing the passage, so that the principles could be applied to the passage. But in this case, Nephi wants us to work backwards to the material, taking the principles we learned in 25 and then working back through the prophecies and through the oracles and through the content of the block. Okay, anyway, that's more than you wanted. That's over an hour of material, and I realize that I've only scratched the surface, and I've said that it's indeterminate. We don't really know. The answer is we don't really know. These are some ideas. I'm comfortable with what I'm learning, that there's strong correlation and or there's a strong there's a rationale for many of these cases as to why this material has a relationship to its situatedness within Second Nephi. And it seems to be that apocalyptic tone is carried over, and some of those things in Jacob seem to set up what's coming in Isaiah. Chapter 25 of Second Nephi seems to give us a sense of how to read the block of material, and then kind of get to the prophecy of Nephi, which pulls out kind of the hopeful nature of Isaiah's writings and of what's predicted in Isaiah, perhaps, including tapping into what's found in Isaiah chapter 11, that the Lord would set his hand again a second time to recover his people. Anyway, a lot to chew on here. I don't know if you want to work through this kind of incrementally or ever, but I hope that somebody will take the time to review this. And I hope I've accurately represented my colleagues and or others that have been working on the Book of Mormon and haven't misrepresented their ideas. I've tried to understand them for what they're saying, and yet also provide evaluation as to where I stand relative to what their claims are and their evidence is, although there isn't time in such a video for that type of thing. Thank you for your time. Have a beautiful Easter. We're coming up upon Easter in General Conference soon. Have a beautiful Easter, and my next video will probably, I've got a lot of things planned, but I'll probably do these videos for a little bit longer. I will come to my year mark at that point, and I'll determine whether or not I have any audience for these types of things, and if not, then I may become less regular on YouTube, but still keep the channel alive. But if there's more interest and I see that it's growing, then I may continue to produce material for this particular channel. In either case, it's what is beneficial to other people, and it's not really, I don't earn anything from this. This is not a monetary venture for me in any sense. So thank you for your time. Have a beautiful day.